This is a special presentation from the Royal Australian Artillery Historical Company's first seminar in the Firepower, Lessons from the Second World War seminar series. This is Dr Peter Layton with Australia's Road to War, 1936 to 1941. This is followed by our speaker panel with Major General Jason Blaine, DSC, AM, CSC, the Head of Land Systems, and Dr Mark Bailey and Dr Peter Layton.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of brevity and clarity and speed, I'd like to introduce Dr Peter Layton, who, for me, doesn't need much of an introduction, and he's asked me not to give him a proper introduction. Peter, over to you.
That's right. So we have a short time. Let's press. In wars, countries apply military power. For this, the essential first step is building the military power needed. The fundamental importance of building military power, lies behind the saying that professionals talk logistics, but amateurs talk strategy. In peacetime, the principal work of defence organisations is building the hard military power that may at some time need to be applied. Implicit in the building of military power is the power made as appropriate to the nation's needs. Today, Australia's National Defence Strategy warns of the possibility of major conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and that this should be prepared for. Australia has done this before in the long lead up to World War II. The experiences of the 1930s and into 1941 provide many insights about how to prepare for such a war of survival. This short talk's pretty high level. It's big picture stuff. Now, given this seminar series is under the auspices of the Royal Australian Artillery Historical Company, there'll be a certain army emphasis. But the story is, of course, larger than a single service. Now, the first part of this talk is about the defence industry strategy implemented in the interwar period. So much more detail than the previous one, which set the scene for this. That strategy back in the interwar period was rather more thought out than today's defence industry efforts. The second part is about army strategy for reservists, about 95% of the army in this period, and who were its expansion base. Did army strategy work? The third part quickly discusses the equipment services, Air Force and Navy, in terms of defence industry. Lastly, a very quick look at what must seem to you the easiest aspect of the first days of a war. Think about what that is as we go through, what the easiest ones are. It's very pertinent to preparedness and mobilisation, but spoiler alert, there's a culture clash involved. We shall now attempt, and you can see, we're going to work through that. Aha! Interwar defence industry strategy. In that 20-year run-up to World War II, Australian thinking on preparedness was shaped by its World War I experience. This war showed Australia needed its own defence industry, as supply chains could be readily cut by friend and foe. The UK obviously cut us off during World War I. Consequently, Australian governments of the 1920s and 1930s worked to establish munitions production within Australia. This was termed the self-containment strategy, or policy. The grand objective was the achievement of self-sufficiency in munitions production in Australia. Australia should be able to defend itself, and this was seen as requiring making munitions in Australia and not relying on others to supply in time of war, because that had failed back in WW1. The self-containment strategy was to be applied initially to munitions which had a very high usage and wastage during wartime. That was small arms ammunition, gun ammunition, field guns, machine guns and pistols. It did not apply to stock items such as blankets, shoes, uniforms, trucks and food, which could be gained from civilian supply outlets. Left off was aircraft production because of cost, and the government's belief that an Australian aircraft industry would emerge if commercial industries were given enough tariff protection and subsidies. This proved a grave error. It should be noted that the Australian government's strategic guidance to the armed forces across the interwar period, 20s and 30s, saw the main threat to Australia being small seaborne raids. This was envisaged as involving bombardment by Japanese cruisers, some light air attack from aircraft launched by those cruisers, and raiding parties of less than 200 men. So quite a small threat in our modern parlance. Munitions Supply Board. In 1921, the Munitions Supply Board, the MSB, was established. And please remember that MSB acronym for all of this talk. It remained until 1939 as it enjoyed bipartisan support in Parliament. The MSB was responsible directly to the Minister for all matters of supply to the armed forces, thus removing the Secretary of the Defence Department from any direct responsibility. This is really very similar to the new Defence Delivery Group that stands up in Canberra on the 1st of July this year. Let's see what they did back last century with such powers. The MSB's head, the Controller General of Munitions Supply, had a unique position in the public service and had a status equivalent to the service chief of the time. Now, the MSB had 3 major objectives, as noted on the slide. The first was the establishment of munitions laboratories with well-qualified scientific and technical staffs. The idea was that being self-reliant in the making munitions in Australia meant using locally sourced materials. Unlike today, the munitions were to be built in Australia, not assembled from imported components. Accordingly, munition designs from overseas, there you go. Accordingly, munitions designs from overseas would need modifying to be able to be built using Australian resources. The laboratories were also to develop manufacturing processes, so that in time of war there was a government centre from which such information could be rapidly passed to commercial companies. This approach aimed to avoid problems with intellectual property. The second objective, as on the slide there, was building government factories for the production of munitions that were either not obtainable from local commercial sources or that were required in peacetime in such small quantities as to render private enterprise production uneconomical. Now, these specialty government factories were not expected to be able to meet all of a war's requirements. Instead, with a moderate workforce turnover, the factories were to provide training for staff in manufacturing techniques according to local conditions. The factories would be useful models for expansion and duplication when a war occurred. Moreover, these government factories could act as technical schools for commercial businesses when these were converted to produce war material. The third objective was the preparation of a scheme for the organisation of the whole industry of the nation, whole of Australia, in time of war. So you see we have a well thought out strategy here. The uniformity of armaments with Britain rule. Now, crucially, the munitions made were under the uniformity of armaments with Britain rule. Prime Minister Stanley Bruce in 1926 declared that the guiding principle on which all Australian defence preparations are based, whether for sea, the land or the air forces, is uniformity in every respect with the fighting services of Great Britain, in order that in time of emergency we may dovetail into any formation with which our forces may be needed to cooperate. Australia was a small nation and its only ally was Britain. Uniformity of armaments made sense, albeit accepting it created problems. Australian munitions were to be made interchangeable with British munitions. The MSB was only allowed to modify specifications to use substitute materials or to modify the manufacturing design to aid local industry production. The operational performance of the munition and commonality of components was always to be preserved. But no degradation meant no improvements either. New innovations in munitions or changes to meet Australian conditions, like the environment being hot and dry, not cold and wet, were not accepted. The Owen gun, for example, had problems being accepted and put into production. It was also a problem when Australian troops fought in Papua New Guinea. It was not like South East England. Today, there is effectively a uniform of armaments rule with the United States. Mobilising Australia's defence secondary industry for war. By 1933, Australia established a sound munitions production foundation, but tensions were rising internationally. The focus now shifted to the third MSB objective, assigned in 1921, planning how to mobilise Australia's industry if war broke out. Commercial industry was needed for 2 main purposes. Firstly, significant quantities of processed raw materials were needed to be able to mass produce munitions, and these had to be provided by commercial companies. Secondly, the MSB government factories that had been established were not designed to manufacture the quantity of munitions required for a major war. They are instead meant to be keepers of up-to-date engineering knowledge and techniques. The nation's commercial industry was expected to make 90% of the munitions required after receiving training and advice from the MSB factories and laboratories. In time of war, a combination of the MSB's limited production capabilities and munition stockholdings was seen as holding the line, while commercial industry ramped up and took to take over and restock the declining stockpiles. The problem confronting the MSB was to develop a detailed plan for the organisation, development and training of secondary industry for wartime production. And things continued to worsen after 1933, to worsen geostrategically. The UK at the 1937 Imperial Conference, we just heard, advised that the UK's rearmament program was straining its resources. Australia should therefore rely more on its own production capabilities. Indeed, the shipment of arms from the UK might not be possible in a new European war, just as it wasn't in World War I. In response, Australia set about building up an arms industry with renewed vigour. In mid-1938, Australia adopted the British idea of shadow factories, refitting these as armament annexes. So a shadow factory is simply replicating an existing factory, if you like. Private companies would not build these annexes themselves as they had no long-term commercial use. Government defence orders were erratic and no company would invest given such high uncertainty, like government-owned contractor-operated. To create the armament annexes, the MSB first selected its suitable commercial state government organisations based on their relevant technical skills and managerial experience. State governments in those days built things, bear in mind. Examples of these organisations were BHP, the various state government railway workshops, and the post office radio workshops. The government then paid for annexes to be built alongside the organisation's factories, equipped these annexes with appropriate machine tools and jigs, and trained the organisation's staff to run it. This is all government paid. The intention was for each annex to be a whole-purpose establishment, that is, one devoted to the manufacture of components for one particular kind of item, such as 18-pounder shell bodies, fuses, or 3-inch mortar bombs. So these annexes were accordingly funded and controlled by the government, but managed on its behalf by the organisation involved. Crucially, these annexes did not displace the normal peacetime production of the commercial factories or government workshops with which they were associated. Annexes could then be run at a low level of production until needed, while the original organisation continued to meet the ongoing normal civilian demand. You still had to keep civilian society going. When war came, the annexes' outputs would then be given priority over civilian needs. In World War II, some 243 annexes or shadow factories were established. In general, all this worked. The self-containment strategy succeeded when tested by a major war. The outstanding Australian industrialist at the time, Essington Lewis, when appointed to be Director General of Munitions, and while the names had changed effectively to be in charge of this MSB organisation, declared in 1940 that the foundations of munitions production in Australia were well laid in the interwar period for the needs of the time against those small raids. Today, the needs are infinitely greater. We require a vastly expanded system. In comparison with what was done in other dominions, I think he's talking about Canada there. We can talk about that later if you wish to. Our pre-war system was good. We need not deceive ourselves, our Australians, that in the past years a majority of the public would have appreciated the very heavy expenditure on munitions. And those words apply today as well, probably. Self-containment proved effective, although later some argued it developed too much capacity and expanding 20% less might have been more efficient. By mid-1943, munitions production was starting to be ramped down. The People's Service, Army. During the interwar period, the regulars averaged only about 5% of the overall Australian military force establishment. Their role then was as an expansion base. In the 1920s, the Army's focus was on maintaining the 7-division organisational structure thought necessary to counter a full-scale invasion. This structure would then be fleshed out if a crisis erupted. Driving this was a desire to keep as much as possible the structure and heritage of the famous first AIF during World War I. In reality, a large number of conscripts flowed through the units for training but rarely reached a satisfactory standard. It was a hollow organisational structure. In the depressed mid-1930s, and now without conscription, Army's focus switched to firstly training commanders and staff, secondly acquiring equipment, thirdly training militiamen. The allotment of priorities aligned with the 3 types of mobilisation envisaged. The first was to meet war with a distant enemy and would require just the manning of coastal defences and the calling up of a few militia units. The second assumed only raids would be undertaken, and these could be countered by 2 divisions and 7 independent brigades of cavalry and infantry. The third full-scale mobilisation would field an army of 200,000 men in 5 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions to meet a major invasion, i.e. what Mark was talking there of the Japanese Army in 1942. Post-war Gavin Logg, an official historian of the Army during World War II, and had some criticisms as well, summed up Army's interwar efforts. He thought that at the time, neither under the compulsory, that is under conscription, or the voluntary system of recruitment was the militia sufficiently well trained for war. It would have needed perhaps 6 months or more of additional training. However, the militia did produce both a nucleus of officers who were capable of successfully commanding platoons, companies and battalions in action, and a body of useful NCOs. These men were fortunate to have been trained by highly qualified professional citizen soldiers who had seen hard regimental service in the War of 1914-1918. That 4 AIF divisions, largely commanded by ex-militia officers, were raised, trained and deployed overseas during 1939-1941, reflected the significance of the expansion-based leadership focus of the 1930s. This strategy might be useful now, but importantly, unlike then, today's army trainers have not seen hard regimental service in a major war against a peer adversary. Making up for that lack, fortunate though that lack is, might be difficult. The equipment services. The fledgling Air Force raised 2 squadrons in mid-1925. These were manned 1/3 by the Permanent Air Force and 2/3 by the citizen part-time Air Force. Both squadrons featured separate flights of fighters, day bombers and Army Cooperation aircraft. These 3 flights provided a basis for force expansion if required. Each squadron could expand to 3, as each flight provided the nucleus of a new squadron of that type, i.e. fighters, bombers, Army Cooperation. By the mid-1930s, it was becoming apparent air power would be very important in the next war, and the next war was inbound. Britain was the traditional supplier of military aircraft to Australia, but could no longer give any guarantees for continuing the supplies of military aircraft in the event of war. Bit of a hard thing to find out in 1937. Given this, several actions were taken. Firstly, the government helped a consortium of commercial interests, including BHP, Broken Hill Associated Smelters and General Motors Holden, to establish the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, CAC. In January 1937, a contract was awarded to the new CAC to manufacture 40 aircraft and 50 engines at Fisherman's Bend, here in Melbourne. The aircraft plant was a replica, if you like a shadow factory, of a North American aviation factory in California, while the engine plant was uniquely Australian and stressed machine tool flexibility of use. The aircraft made became the Wirraway, a mainstay of the Empire Air Training Scheme, where many tens of thousands of aircrew received initial training in Australia, safe from enemy interference. In Papua New Guinea, Wirraways of 4 squadron pioneered forward air control, a tactic used in many wars since. It's the first thing they did. Secondly, the government in the late 1938 ordered 50 Hudson bombers, and these entered RAF service in 1940. A Hudson of 1 squadron sank a Japanese transport ship off Malaya in late 1941. This was the first successful Allied air attack against the Japanese, taking place just before Pearl Harbor. There's a time zone change there. The Hudson was Australia's first American combat aircraft and signified Australia's shift towards America as a supplier of war materials. And thirdly, the government ordered Blenheim light bombers from the UK. Oh, no, they didn't. They later changed to Bolingbroke. No, they changed to the Beaufort. No, it wasn't going to be built in the UK. No, it's now going to be built in Australia because the Brits can't deliver. Bit of confusion going on there. In July 1939, a contract was ordered to build 180 Beauforts, 90 for the UK and 90 for Australia. The division's important. This went not to CAC, an established aircraft maker by this time, but to the Department of Aircraft Production, a government entity. It was later the government aircraft factories. And the Department of Aircraft Production used various state railway workshops. They had skilled staff and infrastructure for building locomotives and rolling stock, but not for building lightweight stress-skin aircraft structures. However, the 10% ownership of CAC by an American company, General Motors Holden, made CAC unacceptable to the UK because the UK's military secrets might have leaked to an American aircraft manufacturer. The Beaufort manufacturing effort required massive decentralised production, with major railway workshops in Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. They manufactured components that were assembled at Fisherman's Bend and Mascot in Sydney. The Beaufort's engines, though, they proved a disaster, and they were replaced by CAC-manufactured Twin Wasps, which required a redesign of the Beaufort, with deliveries delayed into 1941. The first RAF squadron of Beauforts did not form until just after the Japanese entered the war. Now to Navy. At the start of the war, the Navy had some... That's what comes with not looking, doesn't it? At the start of the war, the Navy had some 13 warships, almost all built in the UK, and including 5 World War I destroyers, the famous Scrap Iron Flotilla. In World War II, Australia built 3 Tribal-class destroyers and 8 River-class frigates. These typically took 2 to 3 years to build. Over 3/4 of the new build warships were not commissioned until late in the war, in 1944 and 1945. The fleet with which the RAN entered the war gradually declined as losses mounted, albeit augmented by transfers from the Royal Navy. Now, in this, noteworthy is that some 60 Bathurst-class corvettes were built in Australia in World War II, with construction times varying between 230 and 600 days. These 1,000-tonne corvettes were about 2/3 the size of today's Arafura-class offshore patrol vessels. Additionally, of course, some 2,400 small watercraft were also built for the US and Australian armies for logistic tasks in the PNG and beyond. Major warships always slow to build. They're still slow today, and they were slow then. And when you look at the tonnages, the shipbuilding is just as quick today as it was back in World War II. Conclusion: the easy turns out to be hard. Now, at the start of the war, the munition ordering process was for the services to pass their requirements to the Department of Supply to fill. This simple flow is a bit more complicated, as the manufacturing capacity often needed to be established, build a factory first, before the requested requirements could be fulfilled. Surprisingly, the services who might have been expected to fiercely push munitions buys dithered. They thought government directives vague, and worried that funding munitions proposals might come at the cost of cutting their own more favoured individual service funds. With the war strategy and thus future needs uncertain, two things there, it was possible to assess new material and munitions projects as extravagant or inappropriate. So a week after World War II started, in September 1939, the Defence Department stunningly advised that nothing more will be required from the Department of Supply after orders already placed have been fulfilled. Indeed, the existing munitions making potential was viewed as beyond our present apparent requirements. In short, Defence was effectively advising at the start of the war to close Australia's arms factories and fire their workforces. Great confusion then arose. Even after limitless funding was approved by the Menzies government after the fall of France in June 1940, the military avoided ordering. The military was unsure what to order and of the abilities of Australia's domestic defence industry to deliver. This caused much angst and great culture shock between the military, the government and the hard-driving industrialist Essington Lewis in charge of this newly expanding Department of Munitions. Various measures were progressively adapted to encourage the military to place orders. These had mixed successes, and in the end the Department of Munitions was given approval to work at maximum capacity or whatever materials and munitions it deemed sensible. The government basically said, for goodness sake, just make me some stuff. Consequently, in the war's early stages, defence production was in front of strategy. This situation related as much to the 1939-1940 industry context as to the military confused and bombarded by the demands of war. The military was fairly busy, bear in mind. In the interwar years, effort had gone into sustaining a small government defence industrial base that was deliberately oversized against the approved envisaged threat of small-scale seaborne raids. Moreover, Australian grand strategy in the interwar years, as Mark was talking about, had purposefully shifted the nation from having an agricultural economy, and the nation was then about 5 million people at the start of World War I, to about 7 million and an industrial society at the start of World War II. So it was a remarkable accomplishment. Australian industrial capabilities and capacities were thus impatiently awaiting to be used, and the munition department's passionate and newly hired businessmen vigorously sought this. Now, it may sound slightly sort of strange, but whoops, where we go. This defence production leading strategy was not uncommon. The US and Canada were similar at similar mobilisation times. Two last asides. Firstly, the orders made at the start of a war act to mobilise the defence industry base and thus set the path for the future. It's important to get this initial mobilisation pathway right, or otherwise risk losing time later making changes. So place those orders carefully and know what you're going to do. Secondly, at the start of a war, there can be a tension between what industry can do and what the military believe industry should do. Companies could swiftly manufacture equipment that does not meet the military strategy. On the other hand, the military may want equipment that can't be built by industry until the industry is developed and expanded. Those two extremes, if you like, need active reconciliation and preferably pre-war. The military needs to understand what industry could very quickly provide an extremist. Something may be better than nothing, or not. And with that, the end.
Because on this our subject matter expert panel Major General Jason Blaine, DSC, AMCSC, is the head of Land Systems Division in Defence. Jason has had a distinguished military career spanning over 3 decades, and he's served on multiple overseas operational deployments, including one we shared together, and also an array of both command and staff appointments, including as the commander of the 7th Australian Brigade. Jason is also a graduate of the Australian Command and Staff College and the Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies. He's also a member of the Melbourne Legacy Director of the board here down in Victoria, and which is obviously a very important part to us, our Victorian members who are joining here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll pass over to my colleague, Lieutenant James Dealing, who will moderate the panel for us this evening. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Nick. Well, I think we've had 2 really fascinating presentations today, because when you look at the history of the Second World War and Australia's participation in it, you actually look at the end of the process, where it was certainly a lot clunkier than the picture that you were painting. So it's really interesting to dig into how well the actual industrial mobilisation went to what actually happened on the battlefield for the soldiers. But sir, did you want to start off with a couple of comments about what you're thinking?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, first of all, thanks for the invitation. And when Rob Crawford reached out and Nick to talk about what you were doing here, I was really taken by it, because these are really important elements of how we understand ourselves and understanding history, obviously, so that we can prepare ourselves for the task that we do have now. And I say that because this corps particularly, and what the Royal Australian Artillery are going through, is the most profound change, I think, across our Army's history, and indeed across the corps that I have served with. What we see today in the regiments of the Royal Australian Artillery are very different to only 2 or 3 years ago. And some of the photos you would have seen on the slides of that is demonstrated through things like long-range fires, as Mark talked about. Not just long-range fires, but land-based maritime strike in those long-range fires, where the Australian Army is in the long-range missile age, being able to reach out and deny adversaries at distance. I was present last year when we fired in Australia for the first time a PRISM missile out of a HIMARS north of 300 kilometres onto a target at pinpoint accuracy. A live shot warhead, very interesting that we were planning to do that, ensuring that we had everything in place, because the Americans hadn't done many of those shoots as well. And my great friends within the artillery were obviously instrumental in that activity, particularly the CO of the regiment when he yelled out "splash" while we were watching the screen at Mount Bundy, having seen the missile go to Bradshaw, a long way away. Splash for me as an infantryman is like 3 to 4 seconds max. Actually, it was like 30 seconds. And you could imagine we were all a bit worried that we had not seen the missile. It had gone somewhere else. But it was dead on target, that PRISM missile. You look at what's coming in now, just down the road at Avalon, with the Hanwha facility, the HACE, building the AS9 self-propelled howitzer. First of those being delivered as we speak, the first 3 of those built in Australia. Having it manufactured for the first time, armoured vehicle systems in Tasmania, having our steel bent and welded by Elphinstone, having those hulls and turrets come to Geelong, and then having the manufacturing of those vehicles, which will soon be alongside our infantry fighting vehicles. But the artillery now in the self-propelled artillery area again, a long number of years since they were there. You then look at the capabilities within our integrated air and missile defences, particularly our short-range ground-based air defence with NASAM missiles at 16 Regiment. Again, a fundamental change to our air defence capabilities. Then look at the UAS capabilities within artillery, providing us that medium level of uncrewed aerial systems and the reconnaissance ability of that, as well as maintaining our towed artillery. So with our 155 M777s, a wide range of roles. Now I must say, as infantryman, I was also a mortarman. I was the platoon commander of 6 RAR's more platoon, so I think I know a lot about artillery, which I'll be proven wrong. But the mortars was much more of an area weapon. Now, I say that because this is happening at pace. It's coming into the Australian Army at pace, and the Army has repostured and restructured around the National Defence Strategy that is bringing capability in. Again, my whole career has been about fires, the artillery particularly, supporting manoeuvre. And now it's about manoeuvre supporting fires. And as we're able to project ourselves into the region, being able to conduct long-range fires, land-based maritime strike, the role of the combined arms fighting system, things like infantry fighting vehicles, M1A2 tanks, our combat reconnaissance vehicle, the Boxer, supported by our combat engineer vehicles and our close combat aviation, is really about how we actually allow ourselves to be postured to conduct long-range fire, long-range strike. So that's a change, a fundamental change to the way we see the role of the Army and the way that we have therefore repostured Army within 18 months. And you know, when I was a more junior officer and we're going into the Beersheba model, for some of you that might remember that, we had 3 like-for-like brigades being modelled to support our operations in the Middle East, particularly that ready and reset cycle. We had 3 like-for-like brigades. It took a long time to get there, and we obviously did. We have changed in 18 months what would probably have taken 9 years if we didn't have the urgency to do it. So the Artillery Corps is leading that push. So thanks, glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So for the panel, what lessons for today's military and political decision makers can be drawn from Australia's World War II challenges in defending the nation and the global support network? And thinking, I think it was you, Mark, talked about a coherent strategic decision that was made for the preparation for the industrial mobilisation. What are the things that are different today, and what are the things that we can take out of that period, the pre-war period, that are relevant for today?
I guess I'll kick off on that one then. Coherence, the coherent strategic decision to build up Australia's secondary industry after World War I was based on a very clear understanding of the strategic environment. Now, at that time when they made that decision, Japan was an ally, and Japan had been a very good ally in World War I. You know, Japanese ships escorted Australian troop ships. But who was the only possible strategic threat to Australia? Japan. Are Japanese strategic intents starting to vary from those of the British Empire's strategic intents? Yes, they are. Therefore, that is a long-term strategic threat. They actually thought in 1919 that the Anglo-Japanese alliance was going to be renewed in 1921 until 1931. So they were planning a strategic, a coherent strategic national industrialisation policy to deal from 1919 with the mid to late 1930s. Now, that required very good understanding of their strategic environment. Now, we do understand our current strategic environment. We have wasted our 10 years of warning time, and there is still very... I'm retired, I can say whatever the hell I want.
Please do.
The Australian government's response to this over the last 10 years has been abysmal. So they understand the problem and are utterly unwilling to deal with it. That's the big difference from now between now and 1919.
Peter, did you want to?
Oh, why not? So with that preparation for war, Mark's right, that sort of grand strategy across the 20s, the 20s and 30s was remarkable, if you like. I'd just like to think about just before the war, when the decision was made to expand the industrial base or the defence industrial base, if you like. And I've looked at the Australian efforts, the UK efforts, and the American efforts as far as time goes. And surprisingly enough, because it was the second industrial revolution and the manufacturing type was all the same, each three countries pretty much followed a similar pattern and took about the same time, because there's only 24 hours in a day. So they each took about 3 years to think about things, find the money, design the new buildings, get the stuff organised, and about 2 to 3 years to then implement, actually build the factories, and then, which at the end of that 2 or 3 years, they were at maximum rate production. So it took between 5 and 6 years of actually getting your factories up and running. If you think about today with that facility that they're building for naval strike missile, which I think the Army gets some those Navy strike missiles or something.
Army will get PRISM. Yeah.
Oh, we'll get PRISM. Okay, good point. Yeah. Very difficult. Yes, right. But the naval strike missiles, that building that factory at Newcastle is similarly taking about 5 or 6 years. And equally, building the rockets for the HIMARS system in Australia is similarly taking about 5 or 6 years. It takes time. It takes time today to think about, find the money, design, build things. It did back in 1938 as well. And the second thing was, you'll notice when I skip through the middle there, an important thing about intellectual property. So the advantage of having that government organisation was that the government owned the intellectual property. So the arms that we have today are bought from private companies, often in the United States. And so accessing their intellectual property can be difficult. So if there's one thing that I would learn from those days to bring forward to now is to get that intellectual property now and have it on the shelf sort of somehow, just the off chance you need it, because American companies are not fast at moving with legal issues sort of like this. So I'd sort of press for better intellectual property access.
I'll reinforce something Peter said there. High tech is high tech. There's no difference in lead times. High tech in 1939 is no different in terms of industrial capacity, need to train people, buildings, power supplies, than today. High tech is high tech. And there's no difference across historical timelines.
I agree to a certain extent. The complexity of some of these systems and the integration of communication systems, particularly around that as well, as you look at the size of that, and the cyber threats that are associated with those types of digital systems, puts another dilemma onto you, right? So, while we say the nature of war is constant and the character changes, I think the character of war between what we saw leading into World War II and at World War II is different to the character of war now. You just have a look right now what we see in Ukraine, what we're seeing in the Middle East play out. So we have to understand that. But I agree, the nature of the technology would have been complex enough at the time as well. It just has added to us another layer of complexity that we need to consider. I think, really we're looking at the history of what you see back going into World War II. It's quite interesting to look at how much the government had moved into supporting building these annexes, right? These shadow industries. I think we can read, and I'm a good, infantry officer. I know the rule. Obviously professionals talk logistics and amateurs talk tactics. And I've just become a professional by being in this job. We were oversupplied by those annexes. That was a deliberate, system. Look at the US, and if you read Freedom's Forge, going into World War II, there was no political appetite for building up the defence industries. There was very little, any support from at least the government level. It was all done by industrialists who were willing to take risk and were able to look ahead and see where the world may be going, and then stepping into that space by being able to pivot industries. And I think that's probably the critical thing is we look now at our landscape and understand what are the industries that we do have. And it's a good point, I think, maybe you raised it, Mark, Peter, but understanding what the industrial base looks like. And the National Support Division, that's created within Defence has a role to do that, to understand what we can do from a sovereign perspective, what we need from a sort of a assurance in a overseas perspective. But understanding what you can pivot to is really critical, and that's what was the US success. They were able to pivot a lot of their industries to war fighting. I also now look at, and I might go to your next question a little bit, but I haven't jumped ahead. But what do we know in regard to a strategy? I grew up in an army, like many in this room, where we were really an army to do a broad range of tasks, right? We had to do everything from humanitarian disaster relief through to, peacekeeping operations through to high-end war fighting. So, we definitely were a force that was trying to be jack of all trades. This is now based on the National Defence Strategy with an investment program that is aligned to it, is about being a focused force. And for the Army, it goes back to my opening monologue about what we are doing in regards to our ability to conduct littoral manoeuvre to support that long-range fire effect. Being a focused force at times is good because it really drives where the investment priorities go. And interesting, in your presentation, Army didn't know how to spend their money, right? Imagine those days. Didn't know where to spend its money, but we have been very much clear-eyed about where the priority goes. I think there's a bit of strength in that. I think that's what you've got to do when you're actually making sure every dollar counts. Yeah.
So, you, Peter, mentioned briefly the issues with the engines for the Beaufort bombers, which came about because we didn't use the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. We got the railway sheds to do that, and they were used to building
locomotives,
and the tolerances were a lot finer for an aircraft engine. Who would have thought? But that was what created a lot of the issues that we had there. So, sir, I agree with you. We've got a lot of integrated circuits. There's the communications component. What are the challenges going to be moving forward that are going to be new, given the fact that a lot of we're aiming for sovereign manufacturing capability, which means sovereign availability of the raw materials. We need the ability of the skills of the people who are going to do that, and those skill sets don't come quickly. And the complexity of the platforms that we're putting together. An aircraft, and I think in some respects, an aircraft it was incredibly complex for Australian manufacturing to do back then. But it kind of feels like it's an order of magnitude more than it is today, with the complexity of what it is that we're trying to manufacture.
Look, it's a supply chain issue. We are in a global market that is trying to access, everybody's trying to access the same scarce resources at times. Obviously, a room full of artillery officers, you've probably all got BMWs because, that's how much you get paid. But remember back in COVID, right, when we ran out of chips and BMWs were being produced without, head-up displays, there was issues about the length of time to get a vehicle in. I remember speaking to my German colleagues when I got into this job, and BMW itself went and bought as many washing machines as they could just to take the chips out so they could actually utilise that in their vehicles. We are in a market where we are trying to compete for those resources as well. So that's a risk, but it's also opportunity. The fact is that a global supply chain is also about global production. Hanwha is building armoured fighting vehicles here in Australia. First time they've moved off the Korean Peninsula to do such an activity because they want depth in their global supply chain. We're building Boxer combat reconnaissance vehicles in Australia for the German army, so to export them back to Germany, again, utilising the global supply chain. So that's a part of it, right? I think it's about how you then assure those global supply chains, which is the critical thing. What is a sovereign capability requirement? How do you ensure you've got what you need to maintain the capabilities that you're actually building? We haven't built vehicles for a while, right? We've now got sort of lots of their expertise, but this town alone, the number of people employed in my division who were in Ford and bringing that technology, that design, engineering design skills into what we're doing today in armoured fighting vehicles is absolutely apparent, right? We've got that skill set still there. So we're producing vehicles in Bendigo, producing vehicles here in Geelong and up in Brisbane. we've got to continue looking at how we can support that, maintain that, and that's why we are so focused on in our Defence Industry Development Strategy, the DIDS. If I could mention that to you, the DIDS is aligned to our investment program, but it's how we go after sovereign industry priorities. What are the priority areas? The one that I'm responsible with Owen, who's here from Owen runs our long range fires program, so that's why HIMARS can fire prisoners, because of Owen and his team. We are focused on the land combined arms fighting system. That is obviously shaped towards the Littoral Manoeuvre. We've got to look at export opportunities so we can continue getting scale. And it's all about scale. You need to get numbers to make it for industry, ability to lower price, increase workforce, and maintain scale. So that's a challenge, right? You've got to continue looking at opportunities to support industry in that regard. I think overall, it's about understanding the market, having market intelligence, having really good understanding about what areas you could pivot, what areas you've got adjacencies on. So where a manufacturer can do other area work now, but you can move them to uplifting their production. We still have a Lithgow small arms capability here. Obviously, TELUS own the Lithgow factory where we produce our small arms, particularly our F-88s and our F-90s, plus other weapon systems. Maintaining that capability to allow you to ensure that you've got what you think is sovereign requirements is really important.
So the scaling up component, I think small arms, we produced 1.8 billion rounds of small arms ammunition in the Second World War. 8 million rounds of medium artillery, which I'm assuming are 25 pounders, ammunition. So that's a decent fire plan. 5 million grenades, 4 million mortar bombs. So how was that done back then? Oh, and so that is going to be an extant problem. So if you believe the popular press, in the first 3 days of the offensive against Iran, the United States went through 4.5 years worth of supply of Tomahawk missiles. So it'll take them 4.5, at the current rate of manufacturing, it's going to take them 4.5 years to replace that. So that is that really highlights the importance of magazine depth. How did we scale back then? Because these are impressive numbers. 1.8 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Wouldn't have thought that it was that high. You wouldn't have thought the army would have needed that many. How did they do that, and how do we respond to that challenge today?
So there's a couple. Picking up that one in the previous question there about what did they do then that we should learn from. In the first year or so of the war, bear in mind that the military of the time was not necessarily experts in defence industry manufacturing techniques. Okay, they were sort of focused on fighting wars rather than industrial techniques. So while they had a second industrial revolution kind of manufacturing that needed to keep going, and as was just said, you need to keep production lines going and you need to keep them hot, because once you stop them, restarting them again takes you a long time. People, or the military right at the very start of the war, didn't understand about that sort of stop-start nature. You actually needed to keep things rolling on. So I think as far as getting large numbers goes, it's sort of one of those things that you need to keep on building stuff, which also means, of course, that when you want to upgrade something on the production line, that's hard as well, because you might have to stop or change things overnight so that you can keep your mass production going. And of course, the scaling we spoke before was obviously build a whole pile of replicate the factories, if you like. And replicating the factories was actually the easy bit. The hard bit was finding the workforce. And you've got to find the workforce, so you take them out of civil society. So when you take them out of civil society, just bear in mind that historically it's been that you can allocate about 10% of the total population, which is about 20% of the workforce, because many of the population are children, obviously, etc. But about 20% of the workforce, you can't take more than that away from society, or else the society starts to fall apart. And as soon as society starts to fall apart, what happens then is the military can't do its business. It's curious to see that with reading some stuff recently about the Finnish winter war, when the Russians are advancing on the sort of out of stage right, was that after a few weeks of complete mobilisation, if you like, they exceeded that 20% margin. They found that the back line was falling apart and had to start demobilising, just as Australia did back in 1943, to demobilise some people to go back to the farms to bring in the bring in the crops. So when you talk about these large numbers, building the factories, think of the workforce as well. And the Lithgow one's a great example in that they built the factory in Lithgow. It's away from Japanese cruisers passing sort of passing city heads and firing shots and stuff like that. Really good. But when you wanted to expand Lithgow, there's no workforce there. They had to start building the little minor things that people need, like places to live, things, sort of places where they can eat, etc., etc., etc. So I'd sort of say something we should learn from World War II as well is to distribute manufacturing around Australia with that workforce in mind. In Toowoomba at the moment, they're building these GoSpat Loyal Wingman vehicles, which are assembled from, because no one makes anything anymore. It's all you're assembling subcomponents made by other people. But nonetheless, you can't rapidly scale up assembly in Toowoomba because there's just not that many people there. So think about distributing defence industry around Australia, not just from a military point of view of protecting it from the bad guys, but just to be where the workforce is.
And there's another part here too. It's understanding a strategic environment. Peter mentioned in 1943, we're pulling people out of the army to go back to the farms. Why? What was Australia's major strategic contribution, grand strategic contribution to World War II? Had nothing to do with the ADF at all. It was the fact that 80% of the calories consumed by the 3 million American sailors, soldiers and airmen west of Hawaii came from Australia. That was our major contribution to World War II. That's why at the end of the war, the Australian government or the Australian people were owed money under the Lend-Lease program because food supply was a Lend-Lease thing. You've got to understand the strategic environment before you make some of these decisions. You can still have gaps. In World War II, 1940, fine, we loaded up all the ships with all of the ammunition, gave every ship we had a full ammunition loadout, and that was it. We didn't have anything else. There wasn't another 8-inch shell or 6-inch shell on the continent.
And you have to admire the politicians' toughness of the times. So the rations allocated to Australian civilians in 1944 and 45 are amongst the worst were the worst of the whole war, if you like. So Australian children are going hungry to feed American servicemen. Imagine selling that one today.
The other thing you have to sell, by the way, is that in the event of a major regional conflict today, the Australian population overall will lose at least 1/3 of its standard of living. We lost that in World War I, we lost that in World War II, and there has to be strategic messaging from government that, fellas, if this happens and people, your current standard of living is probably half of what you've currently got, and you're going to have to grin and bear it.
That model you talk about in Australia, I think, is a very prime opportunity for this in regard to how you distribute manufacturing and build up a base. I was fortunate to go across to the US last year and see a few of these areas where they actually are building and manufacturing missiles, HIMARS, tanks, etc. They do those in places that are quite remote. Now, Camden in Kansas is where they build, Arkansas, sorry, is where they build the HIMARS vehicles and they produce missiles. But what they've done in that sort of remote community is they've created an education program and a way of maintaining a population of about 150,000 people who all feed into the factory through jobs, right? So kids go to school and they want to finish school and go work in the factory and make missiles, or go work in the factory and make tanks in places like Enniston. So where you are building local communities, but having a way of ensuring you're maintaining a throughput of educated, skilled workforce. It works. They've been doing that since World War II. Right.
It's a big lesson for us to learn.
So producing the the equipment's one thing, getting it into the hands of the troops is another. There's an oral history of Bob Semple, who was a gunner for the 2nd 12th, and he talks about training in the Middle East, and they mapped out what a 25-pounder looked like on the ground, and they stood in their positions based on the markings in the sand for that gun. We think about the Battle of Kokoda, where at Ishurava, there was a company sergeant major who the Bren gunner in front of him falls over. He picks up the Bren, empties the magazine, and then says, "How the bloody hell do you change a magazine on this thing?" That was the last thing that he said. Company sergeant major, he is the expert in the company. He should know everything. They were handed their Brens at Owen's Corner as they were heading up. What were the problems? And so no training. They literally, we talk about a Soldier's 5. He didn't even get the Soldier's 5. What were the problems why were we in RAAF 75 Squadron with the P40s? They got those P40s, which were the Tomahawks, which were also called Kitty Hawks. Oh, sorry, Kitty Hawks, yes. But the Tomorrow Hawks or the Never Hawks, because they seem to take a very long time to appear. What were the hold-ups in ensuring that we were ready to arm and train our soldiers and pilots?
Sorry. Well, I mean, certainly from the aircraft point of view, of course, it was simply that it was very difficult to buy aeroplanes. Now, bear in mind, before the Japanese attacked, most American support went to the UK. Naturally, there's very little for Australia because there was not a particular need for Australia. Now that 1939 period until late 1941 was very fortunate for Australia from an industrial mobilisation and an army mobilisation sort of point of view, because of course it did give people time to be trained, but it also meant, of course, that people were training on equipment that had not yet arrived, which is probably what would happen in the real world as well. You know, if you want to expand a force, it's going to be pretty hard to give everybody equipment all at the same time. So I will now divert from this completely to make an observation about the future, because someone made it to me yesterday, and so it was hard to get. There were issues about supply. Trains were short. There was a whole pile of issues, I suppose, is that. But I was reminded yesterday that in Ukraine, which operates a completely different equipment supply system to us, if you like, each division or so, often a brigade, has its own line into various factories and various organisations, and they can literally, it's like an Amazon, if you like. You place an order for what you particularly like, and they'll build you a drone based on the order that you want, for example. But you can place the order for the kind of military equipment you want and get it delivered next week or so. So they've got a very strong linkage between the front line and the back line. Now Australia has the tyranny of distance, so that linkage is much more difficult to do. But in the modern world of connectivity and complexity, those are the kind of things that can actually help us and help push stuff forward before before, say, the front line has to order something that then goes back, that is then processed, that gets funded, that all that sort of stuff that goes on before it's actually pushed forward. For the 6 months involved doing that nonsense, you can actually have the frontline units, if you like, requesting stuff direct from the manufacturer. It's a concept in the Anglo-Saxon world. We have a lot of trouble with that one, but it's certainly a concept that works for them and it's probably worthwhile looking at.
I just wonder though, James, is it be any different? I mean, even in our experience of recent conflict, the Middle East, Afghanistan particularly, there's an action, reaction, counteraction with the enemy all the time. So you're learning in war as well. And the best example of that is the counter ID fight, right? When we were obviously at all times trying to, with a very agile enemy who continued changing the way they would employ an IED, you were countering it. So introducing ECM, introducing jamming capabilities, changing the way you conduct patrolling, changing the way you might manoeuvre elements with, with OPs and oversight, the way you might conduct, even basic drills with how you employ your combat engineers. That's always, I think, a cycle of conflict. And I know at Kokoda, for example, we were really outgunned. We were outranged by the Japanese. We didn't have the range with some of our machine guns, like they're getting Vickers up there, etc. So I think it's not unusual, and Ukraine's a great example of that. The way that war has moved, and what now a drone operator can do just by learning on the battlefield and introducing that technology, I think it's actually going to be constant. That is the sort of nature of war. That is constant in that regard.
And to reinforce that point, none of this is really new. We've had other examples in different scales entirely to this, but one of the reports I managed to salvage was the report of the Department of Defence 1914 to 1918, never completed, as the poor fellow who was writing it said, I need to go to France to look at the logistics supplier to the AIF there, and he had an unfortunate encounter with a 5.9-inch shell. But that particular report stresses a number of things, and one of the major things I got out of reading it was that train to the circumstances you need and don't overtrain. And Navy is really bad at this. You want a leading seaman, you train him to that standard. But there are entire mission sets which Navy will have to do in war, but not now, which do not require very much training. For example, putting boom defences across our ports so that unguided underwater drones don't come in and blow the living daylights out of major pieces of critical infrastructure. So it's a very complex issue. I'd say it's wickedly complex because at the same time you've got to train an Aegis operator for an Aegis-capable ship doing cooperative engagement, and that's really tough. And also, of course, an infantryman today is a very different training burden to an infantryman from World War I or World War II or Korea or Vietnam.
It wasn't the first parachute jump by the artillery without any parachute training. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
Into NADZAP.
NADZAP, correct.
Indeed.
Yeah. Worked.
That's called learning on the job, isn't it?
I know there's the best model on there. Looking. Neil's not giving me a really good look at that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, Peter, you talked about the three courses of action that Australia may need to respond to. So, localised raiding.
Yes.
Yep. So the third one was fielding an army of 200,000 men, 5 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions to meet a major invasion. I think it's really interesting to reflect on the fact that the permanent military force was about 3,000 in 1938, 80,000 militia. Army actually mobilised to 730,000 soldiers, and 400,000 of those served overseas. What are some of the tips on how to do that? Because that's an incredible feat when you think about that. And that critically, that's off a population of just 7 million.
Yeah, so I said before about the maximum number that a society can generate, if you like, about that sort of 20% of the workforce and things there. And it's interesting that during World War One, that generally speaking, in World War I there was no conscription, so it was volunteers only per se. But a different world. And most country towns and communities, they were happy enough if they lost a third of the able-bodied men to the front line, but no more than about a third. 2/3 had to stay behind. They felt that third was doing was doing their bit, if you like. So in sort of any society, there'll be a limit about how many people that you can actually conscript, mobilise, etc. And I think one of the things that they actually did right at the very first, just before the war. Bear in mind, the census wasn't particularly good in those days either. So in 1939, very early. The Department of Defence and various organisations ran a census of Australian males. You had to go to the post office and fill out a detailed form about what you did, what your health was, good, bad or indifferent. Most people chose good. Most people did the census, most being 95%, etc. So it was a fairly accurate thing. Now, that lot of filing cabinet files, if you like, allowed the allocation of your workforce. that stage, it was all, they were just thinking males, of course. By 1942, they're thinking about why didn't we do this for the women as well, and they had to do one then for females as well. But that allocation of the workforce is important here to get huge numbers like that. You can't have just anybody join up, because especially today, many of our contractors, they're actually the key maintainers supporting the Navy, Army and Air Force. They can't join up for a starter. Many of our reservists are medical professionals running hospitals and things. They can't all vanish off for sort of 5 years because the civilians still expect medical care. And there's a whole lot of occupations like that. So I think that doing that census just before the war was actually a very clever move, so they understood what the workforce was out there, literally down to the individual level. Imagine the job of cataloguing about 1 million returns of these little cards.
We did reintroduce conscription.
And
universal military conscription.
for 6 weeks training in the militia, etc.
Yeah, we kept extending.
Yeah, we did. It's
And
true.
we allowed them to serve overseas. So it is different than 1940.
Well, I think.
Oh, in that
sorry.
regard, yes.
I was going to say, I think the strength that we've maintained is the training institution, the training establishments, and the ability to expand, right? So you look at, in the presentations, about that core of professional NCOs and officers, but, you know, your ability to expand, and, you know, again, it's not the same scale at all, but in the mid-2000s, we had 4 concurrent operations occurring within the ADF, you know, Solomon Islands, Timor again, Afghanistan and Iraq. We grew battalions. We were able to expand the training base because we had the nucleus being maintained, and that's where we sent our best people as instructors. So I think the key there is ensuring that you've got the ability to expand from those training establishments, maintain that skill set, that professional level of education, and ensure that, you know, you can distribute that, you can disperse that training, but you keep the core elements alive. Don't shrink on actually who you're putting into those organisations.
Just 3 short points to reinforce those. First, in 1939, the entire mass personnel training system built in 1914-15 was still there. The people who ran that system were still there. So we had a mechanism, structure, and the infrastructure, training grounds, barracks, whatnot, to actually train massive numbers of men very, 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 very quickly. Second, in the event of any future major conflict on that same sort of scale, conscription in this country will be required immediately, in particular conscription of women. In 1942 in Britain, women were subject to conscription. By the second half of that year, 16-year-old girls were getting their notices and saying, yep, you're leaving school and you're reporting to that munitions factory in Scotland or whatever. And thirdly, that national census, if you will, that's just the equivalent in personnel and personnel skill terms of a national industrial audit. It's just a national human resources audit. So again, that's another thing that needs to be done probably yesterday.
Interestingly, in Estonia, you look at the Baltic states and what they're facing from a threat from Russia. School kids are taught to use drones in primary school. Now, it's couched on, you know, it's not couched on warfighting, but that's exactly what it is. It's about training a nation who's quite small with a very big threat. How do you actually maximise the population you have? And that training begins very early. So you've got very proficient kids learning how to, you know, fly these things if they ever needed to in an operational sense. Yeah.
Interesting. We're nearly at the end of the panel discussion, but I'll throw it open to questions from the floor. But yes, Nick. Nick, there's a microphone over there.
Oh, I know, but this is for the recording.
Okay.
Okay, I've enjoyed this, but I'm a bit frustrated. By February 1942, we were spending more on our defence each fortnight than we spent annually in 1938. Right? I think the height of GDP spending on defence during the war was about 43-44%. We learned lots and lots of lessons, and we forgot them pretty soon after the war, and from the mid-1980s, we've got a lot of them in the Department of Defence. When we were all young people in the department, no, it's not Jason, the department had 22,000 people working in defence factories as late as the late 1980s. And they all got privatised, some successfully, some not. My key question is it's all very good, and I agree with nearly everything all the speakers have said, but why do we keep forgetting? I'll propose something to you, and I'd be interested in the comment, particularly from our two speakers. Most of these problems emerged after the Tang reforms in 1973. There was a lot of good stuff in Tang and a lot of very bad stuff, but one of the worst stuff was that instead of having the Department of Supply and 3 service departments, each with a minister and a Minister of Defence, we ended up with a structure with one minister, occasionally you get a few more, trying to run a structure. But the real problem is they're a customer for advice from the department. Whereas from World War II until the Tang so-called reforms, each of the Department of Supply and each of the services run by a statutory board. In the Navy, the Minister chaired the board, and they were involved right from the start. So from the moment you start talking about developing a capability or developing the industry to support it, the ministers were involved because they had to be. And they were involved right from the start. And John Gordon, for example, a very poor Minister of Defence, was regarded as the most successful Minister of the Navy in the country's history, and I think Mark would agree with me. The problem you've got now, though, is we've got a ministerial supervision structure from the minister down that causes all these things to be forgotten. And, Mark talked about Essington Lewis being given enormous powers. Part of that survived in the Department of Supply very late in the day, and we threw it away. Now, I'd be interested in your views on whether the reason we keep forgetting all these things and we keep making the same mistakes is because our overall structure of running how we think it and how we task it and how we plan it is no longer run by ministers in Parliament. It's run by huge bureaucratic machines in both the government and private industry. And that's why we keep making the same mistake over and over again, except next time it's going to be a lot more serious. Why aren't the ministers?
I'll jump into that one first.
Why isn't Parliament and the ministers in control anymore? And is that the cause of the problem?
Okay, it is a cause of the problem. This is one of these complex problems. There's some really good work been done at ADFA over the last 20 years on, I think, the problems of times of deep peace. Because when you're in a time of deep peace, you have no threat. When you have no threat, you don't really have to do your job because it's not going to have any consequences at the political level. So that's a major driver of the Tang reforms, for example, because by that time, we're in times of deep peace. What's the threat from the USSR to Australia in that era? Negligible. So we can now start to play political games and improve all that bureaucratic stuff. Secondly, we seem to forget constantly that working by committees is never a good idea because the definition of a committee is a life form with 6 or more legs and no brain. And I've worked enough with the senior defence committees to see how things just get glued all the time and there's just no progress, or it's way too slow, it's way too glacial. Another thing is risk aversion. We work in an extremely risk-averse society. We didn't used to be like this.
One point, Mark, is we've institutionalised.
Yes. Now, all of those things have been institutionalised within a bureaucratic structure, and a bureaucracy's main aim in life is its own self-perpetuation, even if it doesn't produce anything. So it's a complex series of problems, a bit of a Gordian knot, and I have no idea how to untie a Gordian knot. To my knowledge, there is only one proven way of meeting the issue of a Gordian knot, and that's with Alexander's sword and cutting the damn thing. And I'd point to some countries which have done that, in particular, for example, Argentina.
Yeah, it's probably just that Australians have developed this particular form to an art form, So we're clearly world leaders in procrastination. However, a bit more seriously. So it is interesting reading Andrew Ross that So in the interwar period, we had this very strong Munitions Supply Board here, and the three services and three services reported to their individual ministers, and MSP reported to the Minister of Defence as well, the two ministers as well. But Shedden, what was Shedden's first name? Frederick. So Frederick Shedden goes overseas to the Imperial War, to the Staff College, and learns all about the British system. He comes back and he convinces the minister of the day in early 1939, and the services were supporting him, that this large munitions supply organisation should be broken up, and the services should have their own supply organisation within themselves. And Shedden's ambition was the Department of Defence that had just been created was to coordinate everything. And he was focused upon coordination of policy rather than actually doing anything. And that was a particular problem because there were lots of committees formed and they all spoke amongst each other. But he was fascinated by policy, not by implementation. And of course, later we get to the neoliberal world of the 1990s, where that's actually considered the norm, policy implementation being separated. But what broke it there was that the war starts, and I mentioned that business about the orders and sort of all this sort of stuff like that, and the funeral that went on. And basically nothing was done between September and the fall of France. And the fall of France is Dunkirk and losing most of the British Army equipment. The Battle of Britain, things are looking a bit grim here. And the fall of France actually motivates Menzies to cut the Gordian knot. And he appoints Essington Lewis and recreates effectively the Munitions Supply Board. Why did Essington Lewis recreate this? Because he'd been working with them previously and knew they had some good ideas, but they were hornswoggled by sort of all this comment about policy. And it was that era, or 18 months lost, if you like, of focusing on policy by people who didn't understand about lead times and production rates and keeping production lines going. So I think it's that gap between actually doing stuff and talking about stuff, if you like. And the Department of Defence, in my experience, since at least the early 1990s, does like talking about things, does like policy, but the implementation, actually getting stuff in the field, is quite a different order of magnitude. It's completely disconnected. So you've got if you like, the Canberra bubble, and you've got the rest of the ADF. And from my experience, the rest of the ADF's having a jolly nice time out there, having lots of fun flying aircraft and driving ships and wandering around tanks. But it's quite divorced from the people in Canberra. So I agree with you. It's Gordian knot time. It's the fall of France time. This needs to be streamlined. The 19 3-stars. This really is a bit too many.
Don't go too early on that one.
except one. So the Deputy Chief of the Swedish Air Force spoke at the Air Power Conference on Tuesday, and someone asked him a very similar question to that. What's the most important thing that you've learnt in the last 3 years of getting serious? Because the Russians are obviously just over there. He said the most important thing was to get rid of all these extra headquarters and committees. And he said in the Air Force, everything, acquisition, supply, the whole 9 yards, is under the Chief of the Air Force. He's an extremely streamlined, rather flat management structure. But he said it's actually making things happen. Gordian knot time.
Yeah, he's accountable too.
Yes.
My name's Andrew Phelan. I'm a China background. I've been speaking in the media publicly about what I call the China challenge. My question to you, gentlemen, is how important do you think that this becomes a national conversation around the dinner table, in pubs, at work, and so on? And I use the example of a year ago we had a planned flotilla circumnavigate our country. Seemed to catch the Prime Minister flat-footed. It was very awkward. Around Christmas time, the Defence Minister identified a similar planned group off the Philippines, and it emerged last month in Senate estimates where Admiral Hammond was asked about this, that they came within 6 or 7 nautical miles of our exclusive economic zone. That was not made public. What is your take on that, and how important do you think it is that this become a national conversation?
Over to you, Mark.
I think it's absolutely critical take a look at history, take a look at where we were in the 1930s, where the strategic threat was. It's from the same general geographic location, it's on the same axis, it's a bit further away, but it's actually far deeper. One of my favourite little games when presenting at conferences, especially overseas, is to spot the Uniting Front people there. And how many suborned, if there's 6 Chinese academics, there'll be 6 suborned academics. You know, that's not their fault, they don't have a choice. And there's one Uniting Front guy, and I always bait them, and they respond very predictably. So that's the degree of penetration. And we've got to look at that. If you take a look, and I'll mention it in the next address I give, Ross Babbage's excellent 2 volumes from 2019 on Chinese hybrid warfare. We have been under attack, deliberate formal attack from the People's Republic of China for 30 years. It's about time we recognised it. And I don't mean military attack. I'll go through what hybrid warfare is in that presentation for those who stay here. But the last little tiny bit is the kinetic bit where you're shooting at people. 95% of it is influence, it's cultural operations. I've worked out in the Pacific with the federal police as this, the degree of takeover there, which the Chinese government works hand in glove with Chinese transnational organised crime to take over the economies of the island states.
Just for the record, Mark, I'm the sole Australian to be arrested in his own home as a result of my public commentary on this issue.
Oh, okay. I'm not. That's rather a dubious sort of claim to honour.
It really is. Yeah.
Maybe I'm about to become the second. But yeah, it does need to become a very common topic of conversation because we face a major strategic threat. End of story.
I suppose you also have to bear in mind, Australia's never fought, if you like, a great power by itself. It's always been with an ally. And nations normally, middle powers like Australia normally don't fight great power nations and survive. Ukraine's a bit of an exception here. It's historically fascinating. So it sort of while it's a threat and that's all good, we sort of do need to be sort of cognizant of our own abilities, if you like. But I think that you're right. It is up to the government to mobilise the population in that particular regard. But of course the government, this government, last government, previous government, name sort of every government back for the last sort of 40 years or last 30 years is aware that China is important to many Australians from a financial point of view. You know, and the iron ore magnates of Western Australia would be very disappointed at us having this conversation. So the government of whichever party of whichever day has to do a balancing act between, if you like, that hybrid war, Great War brings up our American security alliance, and the financial interdependence between us and the Chinese, and it's a balancing act. And at the moment, of course, there are some concerns by some people about this other side over here, about the US alliance as well. So we don't want to burn our bridges here. If the future could turn out well, but the future may not turn out well. So we need to be careful and hedge and have a few capabilities here whereby we can still keep the farm, if you like. We don't want to lose Australia. So I think it's a difficult balance. It's a difficult balancing at the present time. But I agree that the government has to, if you like, lead the conversation. At the moment, it's clearly not interested in doing that, it's hiding probably both from the Chinese and from the other side as well.
Can I make one little final tiny comment there? Welcome to the strategic structure, shape, and environment of the 1880s. We've been here before.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for the great discussion. We covered I think we're out of time for questions.
We are.
Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Can I ask you all to join with me in thanking Mark Bailey, Jason Blaine and Peter Layton. steered by James Ealing, for a really, really impressive plenary session that rounded off this evening. After this, there will be a short break. The bar will be open. Snacks will be served, and for those who would like to stay for the networking presentation starting at 7:30 p.m, you're more than welcome. Please can you just find out who those people are. But can you join with me now in closing the seminar and thanking everybody on stage.
Thank you for
While you've read the previous forward, I'm sure that you're